And I'd like to hand over to Mark Frost.
Thanks very much, Simon. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us this evening for this third instalment of the Guild of St George's Voices from Venice series, and to offer my thanks to Peter Burnham in particular for coming up with the idea and for organising the series. I do hope you'll also be able to join us for the final instalment on the 11th of March, hosted by Rachel Dickinson, and for our one-day follow-up conference on the 2nd of April. Ruskin's engagements with Venice were so enduring and so significant to 19th century culture that they continue to be the object of intense and rewarding scrutiny. Like so many others, Ruskin was astonished and bewitched by this most intriguing and fantastical of cities, and his literary responses to it in works like The Stones of Venice and St Mark's Rest shaped subsequent discussions down to the present day. His celebrations of the organic beauties of Venetian Gothic and his idealization of Gothic craftsmen are rich, perceptive, and distinctive. In addition, and as we shall see very well this evening, his ability to transport readers to the stones and waters of this fabulous city and to conduct them on tours through its art, architecture, and history are unparalleled. Tonight's extract from the Shrine of the Slaves chapter of St Mark's Rest is a prime example. One feels that one is by Ruskin's side as he takes us within the walls of the Scuola del Marte to show us the delights of Vittore Carpaccio. Tonight's speakers will have much more to say on this subject, and I'm delighted that they've graced us with their presence this evening. Michelle Loveridge is a renowned novelist, poet, teacher, and Royal Literary Fund Fellow whose adult novels include Carnevale, The Remedy, and The Book of Human Skin. She's also written a series of children's novels and co-authored the Amazon #1 memoir, My Sister Millie, with Gemma Dowler. She campaigns fervently for better environmental stewardship of the water, particularly in London and Venice, and she's fortunate enough to live in both places. Joseph Meidel is an actor, writer, and public speaker. Hailing from Savannah, Georgia, he studied theatre at New York University and City University of New York, and launched a prestigious theatre career in Nashville, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. Joseph came to England in 1979 to do research for his PhD dissertation on Paul Laurence Dunbar, before making a name for himself at the Edinburgh Festival, the Royal Shakespeare Company, and the Royal National Theatre. His film career includes roles in Mandalay and Woman in Gold, and his most recent television appearances have been in Mrs. Wilson, Midsummer Murders, and Homeland. With no further ado, then, I pass on to Joseph and Michelle to conduct you through what promises to be a fabulous evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that lovely introduction. Now, this is a talk about imagery, so we're going to get straight to the images. There. First of all, I'd like to thank the Guild for inviting me to take part in this great series. Many thanks to Clive Wilmer and to James Spates for great behind-the-scenes chats building up to this, and of course also to St. Simon of the Earphones for his graceful hand in everything that we do here. I also thank Joe Meidel, distinguished actor and my dear friend, for joining us to voice Ruskin's words and also those of some other very fine gentlemen. I'm devoting this talk to one little corner of Venice. It's the part that shares my blood, the Slavic part, and also to Ruskin's love for Vittore Carpaccio, the artist who was commissioned by the Slavs of Venice to paint their own saints in their own sacred place. I speak not as an academic, but as a novelist. Like Ruskin, I believe that painters too write stories, and none better than Vittore Carpaccio, who tells fabulous tales of dragons, knights, princesses, parrots, lions, and far-off lands. I also chose tonight's pieces because they make me laugh. Far too little is heard about Ruskin's wicked irony and his delicious sense of humour. After all, this was the man who could write of himself
My life has been ruined by stupidity. I am a dolt, a cretin, a log, a dead mole, a stuffed hedgehog, a fossil echinus.
And the man who described railway stations like this.
Beastly, blockheady, loggerheady, doggish, loggish, hoggish, poggish, filthy, fool-begotten, swindler-swallowed abominations of modern existence.
But Ruskin also deployed his humor with serious intent, warning,
readers should be clearly aware of one peculiarity in the manner of my writing, namely that if they will enclose in brackets with their pen passages of evident irony, all the rest of the book is written with absolute seriousness and literalness of meaning. The violence or grotesque aspect of a statement may seem as if I were mocking, but every such apparent jest will be found, if you think of it, a pure, very dreadful, and utterly imperious veracity.
Now, before we can get to the pure and very dreadful veracities of this evening, we do have a few threads to unravel. Let's begin with a brief look at Vittore Carpaccio himself. Carpaccio, or Scapazza, was born into a family from the island of Mazzobo in the Venetian lagoon in around 1460. He was the son of a leather merchant. Venetian painting was at its loftiest height. Sorry, next slide might have got too big. Did that slide get too big? There. I'll go back. Venetian painting was at its loftiest height during Carpaccio's time. His contemporaries were Giovanni and Gentile Bellini, Andrea Mantegna, the Vivarini, Tiziano, and Giorgione. One of the most endearing things about Carpaccio is the rather teenagerly way his signature evolved and the creative ways he framed it. Carpaccio's best known work remains his St. Ursula cycle, painted in the 1490s and now in the Accademia galleries. Carpaccio was next commissioned by the Scuola Dalmata to paint the stories that are the subject of this lecture. This work took 5 years, during which, incredibly, Carpaccio was also working at the Palazzo Ducale alongside Giovanni Bellini. Carpaccio succeeded Bellini as the official painter of the Venetian Republic. In 1509, Venice lost most of her mainland empire in the war against the League of the Cambrai. Funds dwindled, art commissions in Venice were scarcer. So Carpaccio took work in places such as Capodistria, where his son, Benedetto, also an artist, took up residence. This square in Capodistria is named after Carpaccio. He died in around 1526. Second, we're going to look at the community who commissioned Carpaccio, the Schiavoni, or Slavs in Venice. It's 1,000 years since Venice and the Schiavoni were first drawn into a warm and symbiotic relationship. I think that relationship has something to say about how we foreigners today can usefully manifest and enact our own love of Venice. It also has something to say about Ruskin and how he interacted with Venice. Ruskin being perhaps the ultimate insider-outsider, a champion and a devotee with something to give that Venice actually needed. So the Slavs and the Venetians were first drawn together by, as you can see from this map, proximate geography and mutual interest. With the Ottomans encroaching ever further west and Mediterranean pirates increasingly audacious, Venice represented both a place and source of safety for the threatened Christian populations of the Western Balkans. And Dalmatia, in turn, stood as Venice's last line of defense against a Turkish domination of the Adriatic. In 998 AD, the Dalmatian city-states appealed to Doge Pietro Orseolo for protection. The Venetian fleet swept in, hunting down and suppressing the pirates. Orseolo was welcomed as a liberator. He and his successors took the title Duke of the Dalmatians. Over the next 400 years, the whole Dalmatian coast became part of the Stato da Mare, the name given to La Serenissimo's overseas possessions. Trade relations flourished, and so did the population of Schiavoni living in Venice. In 1368, Perast, in modern Montenegro, was named Venice's Fedelissima Gonfaloniera, the most faithful of flag bearers. In peacetime, the Venetian war standard was held by the captain of Perast. In times of war, that banner was hoisted to the Navy's flagship. Each year, 12 Perestini, chosen from the most valiant, swore to die rather than allow the Venetian flag to fall into enemy hands. More on this later. One of Venice's great thoroughfares took its name from the Dalmatian merchants who landed their goods there, the Riva degli Schiavoni. By the mid-15th century, there were over 5,000 Slavs resident in Venice, of a total population of about 120,000. Whether German, Albanian, Greek, Armenian, or Jewish, immigration was encouraged by Venice because there were simply not enough Venetians to do the work of the city, particularly the more menial, low-paid work. Pragmatically, Venice assimilated and socialized her immigrants, folding them into the existing system of scuole, or guilds, by which the city neatly organized her social, religious, economic, and civic life. Most of us have been privileged to hear Clive talk about the Venetian scuola, their charitable works, their microcosms of urban, national, or artisanal identity. It was also the scuola that commissioned some of Venice's great art. Each national scuola operated as a nucleus of foreign residents, who were never fully integrated, but defined, accepted, and welcomed as insider-outsiders, licensed to provide the manpower and trades Venice needed, while self-governing within their own confraternity. The scuola was a gateway to work, patronage, housing, and arms for the new immigrants. Meanwhile, the intimate geographies of Venice gradually bound together all those who lived there, whatever their origin, as did intermarriage. In the wider picture, common causes against common enemies did the same. So, in 1451, the Council of Ten said yes when Venice's Slavs asked to set up their own scuola, with a mission to support the Dalmatian community, especially the families of soldiers and sailors who had suffered or died while serving La Serenissima in battle. The Schiavoni were to meet in the disused hospice of Santa Caterina, leased from the Order of St. John of Jerusalem in the Calle dei Ferlani in the east of the city. This later map shows the extensive land holdings of St. John. Back in 1451, the new scuola's facade probably looked like this. 200 confratelli were present on the day of their first meeting. The scuola's statutes reveal that 47% came from the cities of Kotor and Bar in Venetian Albania. Over a third were sailors, crewing the Republic's galleys. Another third were tradesmen, many working on the construction and maintenance of the Venetian fleet. The aims and responsibilities of each Venetian scuola were embodied in its Mariegola, a book of statutes. Here's the Mariegola of the Scuola Dalmata. On its cover, a worked silver image of St. George, one of 3 patron saints. Inside, illuminated pages invoke the saint's protection and record the right granted by the Council of Ten for members of the Slav nation to meet and work together. The Mariegola establishes the days of the Schiavoni's religious services, permits them to worship in their own language, and defines their charitable works, including dowries for poor girls, their financial obligations to the state, and also the roles of the different officers. For its coat of arms, the new scuola adapted the antique heraldry of Dalmatia, 3 lion heads on an azure base. Azure turned crimson, echoing Venice's own flag. Dalmatian soldiers and sailors wore red tunics, later jackets, and spoke in their own Illyrian dialect, a language heavily contaminated with Venetian. The scuola immediately began to acquire relics and sacred art relating to its patron saints, Trifone, George, and Jerome. In 1502, the Venetian patrician Paolo Valeresso presented the scuola with a relic of St. George that had once belonged to the Patriarch of Jerusalem. The bone fragment was delivered to the scuola on St. George's Day in a grand musical procession. The fragment joined the precious trove of saints' remains already collected by the scuola, chief of which was Saint Trifone's jaw. Within 5 years, Vittore Carpaccio had completed his cycle of paintings there, of which more later. This 19th century watercolor imagines a contemporary scene inside. After various disputes with the Order of St. John, the Schiavoni raised their own funds to remodel their building. In 1551, this new facade emerged. The 2 large windows on the ground floor provided a theatrical framing for charitable acts. The Confratelli would distribute food to the poor, as in this painting by Lorenzo Lotto. Slav writers, editors, and publishers soon became part of the successful Venetian printing industry. Inside and beyond Venice, the Schiavoni were becoming known for their loyalty. Their scuola was recognized with privileges and indulgences for the enthusiasm with which they raised money for Venice to pursue war against the Ottomans. Carlo Goldoni prefaced his hit play La Dalmatina, saying it was
about a loyal nation worthy of La Serenissima.
The odd local insurrection still occurred in Dalmatia and Albania, because we Slavs are a fiery lot, but many of the Schiavoni resident in the city prided themselves on being almost more Venetian than the Venetians. The Schiavoni were among the few to protest when Venice ceded to Napoleon in May 1797. While the city's patricians withdrew to their palaces for passive lament, the Schiavoni mobbed the streets crying, "Viva San Marco!" Lower right, in this rather fanciful image, we see the Schiavoni vainly waving their yellow and red Venetian flags against French horses and cannon. Even after Venice fell, her flag still flew in Dalmatia. Perast was the very last Venetian town to cede to Napoleon. Only on August 23rd, 1797, did the Perestini gather to bury the Republic's flag under their cathedral's altar to prevent it falling into enemy hands. This painting by Giuseppe Lalic shows them kissing the flag farewell. Their commander, Giuseppe Viscovic, delivered an emotional speech about the gonfalon, or flag.
Our sons will know of us, and the story of this day will be known in all of Europe, that Perast has worthily sustained the pride of the Venetian gonfalon to the last, honoring it with this solemn act and setting it down wet with our bitterest universal tears. Let us rage, citizens, let us rage. And in these, our last sentiments with which we seal our glorious career under the most serene Venetian Republic, we turn towards the flag that represents us, and upon it we vent all our sorrow. For 377 years, our being, our blood, our lives were always for you, O San Marco, and always your most faithful. We have known you to be with us to be with you, and on the sea, we were always with you, illustrious and victorious. No one ever saw us in retreat, defeated, or afraid. But what else is left to do for you? May our hearts be your most honored tomb, and your purest and greatest praise be our tears.
Giuseppe Praga, in his Storia di Dalmazia, says, and I agree with him, that these are words that could be found only to frame a last farewell to a parent from whom you have received your soul and your life. Unlike the grander guilds of Venice, the tiny Scuola Dalmata would survive the fall of the Venetian Republic. Of more than 300 Venetian scuola, only the Scuola Dalmata and di San Rocco saved their confraternities and their art treasures from Napoleon's closures and larceny. The Schiavoni's cry of
Viva San Marco!
Was heard once more in 1848 when the Scholars members took part in the revolt against the Austrians. Among the leaders was the linguist Niccolò Tommaseo, originally from Šibenik. Tommaseo, you can see it right, commemorated in this statue in Santo Stefano. It was the Schiavoni commander, Antonio Bilanovic, who began the bombardment of the Austrians' new railway bridge into Venice.
Ruskin, of course, would have cheered.
And when bombs fell on Venice in World War I, the Carpaccio paintings were removed from the Scholars' walls and packed in sealed cases. This proved prudent, as the Scuola was damaged when nearby buildings suffered direct hits. In 1940, the paintings were again taken to a place of safety. After the war, they were extensively, though imperfectly, restored, arriving home only in 1947. Save Venice restored the Scholars' facade in 2001-4, and by 2023 will also complete the restoration of the paintings, a work dedicated to art historian Patricia Fortini Brown, author of the key work Venetian Narrative Painting in the Age of Carpaccio. Venice has never stopped attracting the Schiavoni, generation after generation. Following World War II, many, including my own father, uncle, and grandfather, found the Tito regime repressive and left Yugoslavia. My people went to Australia, but many Slavs ended up in Venice, reuniting with old branches of their families who'd emigrated in the time of La Serenissima. I'm always looking for the Loverick name on Venetian doorbells, especially after I discovered a certain Giovanni or Ivan Lovrich, a writer born in Croatia, but living and publishing in Venice in 1776. I have to say I never did find the Loverick name on a Venetian doorbell, so in the end, I put one there myself. The Scuola Dalmata have remained loving custodians of their own Venetian history, setting up a library and an archive in the 1980s. They published books and a magazine. In 1997, the Schiavoni were honoured with this plaque on the Riva named after them. It celebrates the bonds of fidelity that unite Dalmatia with Venice via their 500-year-old Scuola. It's no coincidence that Ruskin, in setting up our own organisation, chose the word guild, probably the best translation of Scuola. Both words give the sense of a lay confraternity, a meeting place, a site of good thinking, a state of mind looking to give rather than take. And this is where we re-find the thread that leads to St. George and his nightly interventions. Around 1255, Jacopo da Voragine published his Golden Legend, in which St. George, a native of Cappadocia, is for the first time in the Western canon framed as a slayer of dragons. So how and why did this dragon-slaying version of St. George become one of Venice's most important patron saints? I have to say it's the usual way, looting. Like the body of St. Lucy, the arm of St. George was among relics brought back from the sack of Constantinople in 1204, just as the body of St. Mark had previously been translated to Venice in 878. Here's St. George's arm in its elaborate reliquary. Once Venice had her own important relic, the saint's cult began in earnest. 4 churches were named in his honor. Now, what of Ruskin and St. George? By the age of 10, Ruskin had written a poem called The Puppet Show. Its first stanza went like this.
I am the bravest knight of all. My armor is of gold. O'er all the field death spreads his pall when I my wrath unfold.
In adult life, Ruskin would summon St. George's wrath to fight both social injustice and crimes against the natural and aesthetic world. He also saw St. George as the link between the maritime empires of Venice and of Britain, identifying in the ultimate failure of Venice a warning parable for the seemingly unstoppable British Empire. The physicality of St. George's dragon also embodied what Ruskin hated about the brute industrialization of Britain. Spewing fire and smoke, the dragon of industry lays waste to beautiful landscapes and whole communities. In this image at left, Ruskin copies the brooding dragon in Turner's Garden of the Hesperides. In the black smoke of industry, Ruskin sees a barely transposed metaphor of spiritual enlightenment violently obscured. He repeatedly conflates fire and steam with oppression of the poor and the contamination of the environment. Here, in Fors 93, he says,
"Your 19th century prince of shams and shambles sells for his own behoof the blood and ashes, and preaches with his steam throat the gospel of gain from ruin as the only true divine, and fills the air with his darkness, the earth with his cruelty, its waters with his filth, and the hearts of men with his lies."
Our species is at present engaged on a deconstruction of the anthropocentric, patriarchal, and colonial vision of our planet. Ruskin was a prophet in this, as in so many things. He saw that capitalism extracts value from the kind of labor that dehumanizes the workforce, cataloguing certain classes, also racially, as sacrifice zones for what is called the greater good, but is in fact the profit of the few. A bitter plague wind, laden with black dirt, extinguishes not just life, but hope, virtue, and nature. Ruskin was having none of that. He set up our Guild of St. George to summon the forces of good to deal with that dragon. In Fors 28, he describes his first adherents as
"a brand of delivering knights."
In Fors 27 again, he describes them as
"at war with the lord of decomposition, the old dragon himself, St. George's War."
Ruskin did not see this battle as allegorical. He wanted sincerely to unwind apocalypse back to Eden, starting with a tithe on his own income, and most of all with a tithe on his own teeming mind. The writing, for example, of Fors Clavigeria, his letters to the workmen and labourers of Great Britain on the moral value of both work and art. Now, let us look at Ruskin's relationship with Carpaccio. For many years, it was not an intimate or admiring one. He fell in love with Tintoretto in 1845, while decrying Veronese, Tiziano, and Giorgione as over-sensual and spiritually lacking. Later, he came to see God's work in the colours of these artists. And finally, in 1869, he took the advice of Edward Burne-Jones and paid some proper attention to Carpaccio. He was an instant convert, writing,
"My dearest Ned, there's nothing here like Carpaccio. There's a little bit of humble pie for you."
In Fors 18, Ruskin declared,
"Painting is the way Venetians write."
He wasn't talking about a lack of literacy, for literacy was high in Venice, but about a way of seeing, explaining, and illuminating via the telling of painted stories. Ruskin came to see Vittore Carpaccio as Venice's leading storyteller, grouping him not with other artists, but with writers, with Plato of Athens, Virgil of Rome, Dante of Florence, and Shakespeare of London. But Carpaccio was more than a storyteller, because he embedded in his narratives a plethora of religious symbols and allusions. These animals, trees, and objects were painted so realistically that their vibrant materiality helped to make the spiritual world relatable. So if painting was the way Venetians wrote, Carpaccio wrote books that could be read at many levels, from a child's delightful picture book to a religious treatise. In 471, Ruskin asserts that Carpaccio was flowering just at the moment of Venice's turn into decline, and is all the more important for that.
His message is written in the Venetian manner, by painting the myths of the saints in his own way. If you will look into the introduction to The Queen of the Air, you will find it explain that a great myth can only be written in the central time of a nation's power. This prophecy of Carpaccio's may be thought of by you as the sweetest because the truest of all that Venice was born to utter. The painted syllabling of it is nearly the last work and word of hers in true life. She speaks it and virtually thereafter dies or begins to die.
In the next pause, he continues.
This then is the truth which Carpaccio knows and would teach, that the world is divided into two groups of men. The first, those whose God is their God and whose glory is their glory, who mind heavenly things. And the second, men whose God is their belly and whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things.
It was while studying Carpaccio's St. George's in 1872 that Ruskin received a telegram summoning him to a reunion with Rose Latouche, the girl he loved. It was a disaster, with Rose manifesting mental health symptoms of the illness that would kill her. She died in May 1875. In the autumn of 76, deranged by loss, Ruskin arrived in Venice. The curators of the Accademia allowed him to take down Carpaccio's Dream of St. Ursula to study and copy in a private room. Ruskin came to believe that Rose was communicating with him through Carpaccio's St. Ursula, and he would attribute the recovery of his lost faith to this close encounter. I'm not the first person to remark on an uncanny resemblance between Carpaccio's painting and Ruskin's own last sketch of Rose on her sickbed. Now, at last, to the chief source of today's readings. St. Mark's Rest was published in 6 parts, with 2 supplements and an appendix between 1877 and 84. The book bears an irascible dedication.
St. Mark's Rest, the history of Venice, written for the help of the few travelers who still care for her monuments.
The tone of St. Mark's Rest is febrile. It can be despairing, melodramatic, almost madly celebratory. These swooping emotions reflect the state of Ruskin's mind, so many years after the Stones of Venice, at a time when he was witnessing those very stones desecrated by brutal, ignorant reconstruction. Henry James decried Ruskin's Venetian ruminations at this point as ill-humorous and aids to depression. James thought the tone to be that of an angry governess and pitched in a nursery key. I disagree. As a human being, Ruskin had been inscribed and scarred by the scandal of his divorce and his rejection by Rose's family. I believe pain had loosened his style, and I think the loosening is magnificent. In 1841, he described Venice as
the paradise of cities.
But by 1876, he's writing in Fours that Venice's green tide
is full of floating corpses, and I must leave my dinner to bury them, since I cannot save.
Still, fortunately, he does not stop writing about Venice. So now Joe and I are going to take you by Ruskin's hand and lead you through what he calls in St. Mark's Rest, the Shrine of the Slaves. We start with the facade's relief of St. George, which Ruskin sees as
notable chiefly for the conception of the dragon as a creature formidable rather by its gluttony than its malice, and degraded beneath the level of all other spirits of prey, its wings having wasted away into mere paddles or flappers, having in them no faculty or memory of flight, its throat stretched into the flaccidity of a sack, its tail swollen into a musculous encumbrance, like an enormous worm, and the human head beneath its paw, symbolizing, therefore, the subjection of the human nature to the most brutal desires.
Ruskin also made a rather contemptuous sketch of it, noting,
form of dragon which the present St. George of England has to conquer. Wings gone to nothing, throat becomes everything. He has not even a respectable or decent devil to fight.
As we can see, Ruskin is thinking about Venice's St. George, along with England's St. George, confronting a vile and worthless nemesis who might, nevertheless, still win. Now let's accompany Ruskin inside the scuola.
Entering, we find ourselves in a little room about the size of the commercial parlor in an old-fashioned English inn, perhaps an inch or two higher in the ceiling, which is of good horizontal beams, narrow and many, for the effect of richness, painted and gilded, also now tawdrily enough, but always in some such patterns as you see.
Ruskin describes the room's rather modest charms, concluding,
a modern Parisian upholsterer or clever Kensington student would have done for you a far surpassing splendor in a few hours. All that we can say here at the utmost is that the place looks comfortable and especially warm, the pictures having the effect you will feel presently of a soft evening sunshine on the walls or glow from embers on some peaceful hearth cast up into the room where one still sits waiting for dear friends in twilight. In a little while, if you still look with general glance yet patiently, this warmth will resolve itself into a kind of checkering, as of an Eastern carpet or old-fashioned English sampler, of more than usually broken and sudden variegation, nay, suggestive here and there of a wayward patchwork, verging into the grotesqueness, or even with some touch of fancy and mask, into the harlequinade, like a tapestry for a Christmas night in a home of 1,000 years old to adorn a carol of honored knights with honoring queens.
He tells us,
but first, we will go round the room to know what is here to read and take an inventory of our treasures.
Following Ruskin's direction, we start with St. George killing the dragon. In fact, it's the second of the three St. Georges in St. Mark's Rest, but for clarity here, we're going to follow the story sequence. According to the Golden Legend, George, a Christian knight, arrives in Selene, modern-day Libya. He happens upon a scene of horror. The city has been ravaged by a dragon. To appease the beast, the pagan Selenites have offered up their youths and maidens chosen by lot. This is the very day when the princess of the city, seen upper right, is on the menu. The whole of the foreground is taken up by St. George and the dragon, who is rearing up with deadly malice, despite unsurvivable wounds. To illustrate its power and the sheer wastefulness of its evil, we see the dismembered victims and scavengers come to feed on the remains. For the dragon has taken just a leg or a lower body, never bothering to finish its cruel snacks. Modern consciousness projects surrealism on this scene, but to Carpaccio's readers, each of these vipers, lizards, and toads, even the half-dead tree behind them, is loaded with so much symbolic freight, we could actually devote the whole of the hour to decoding and unpacking them. But to Ruskin, Carpaccio's dragon and his St. George, inside the scuola, are much more satisfactory than the relief on the facade.
First, on the left, then, St. George and the dragon, combatant both to the best of their powers, perfect each in their natures of dragon and knight. No dragon that I know of pictured among mortal worms, no knight I know of pictured in immortal chivalry, so perfect each in his kind as these two. What else is visible of the battleground of living creature? Frog, newt, or viper, no less admirable in their kind?
In Fors 26, Ruskin has noted that Carpaccio's saint goes into battle bareheaded. He has already thoroughly mocked a different depiction by Benedetto Pistrucci, engraver to the Royal Mint.
How brightly comic it is, the horse looking abstractedly into the air, instead of where precisely it would have looked, at the beast between its legs. St. George, with nothing but his helmet on, being the last piece of armor he's likely to want, putting his naked feet at least his feet showing their toes through the buskins, well forward, that the dragon may with the greatest convenience get a bite at them, and about to deliver a mortal blow at him with a sword which cannot reach him by a couple of yards.
In contrast,
Victor Carpaccio had other opinions on the likelihood of matters in this battle. His St. George exactly reverses the practice of ours. He rides armed from shoulder to heel in proof, but without his helmet. For the real difficulty in dragon fights, as you shall hear, is not so much to kill your dragon as to see him. At least to see him in time, it being too probable that he will see you first. Carpaccio's St. George will have his eyes about him and his head free to turn this way and that. He meets his dragon at the gallop, catches him in the mouth with his lance, carries him backwards off his 4 feet with a spear point out at the back of his neck.
Ruskin produced 2 studies of this work. This one is a watercolor showing just the upper, importantly bareheaded part of St. George. And he also sketched the whole painting, as you can see here. Ruskin assures us,
here, however, our dragon does not fail us, both Carpaccio and Tintoret having the deepest convictions on that subject, as all strong men must have, for the dragon is too true a creature to all such spiritually. That it is an indisputable living and venomous creature materially has been the marvel of the world, innocent and guilty, not knowing what to think of the terrible worm, nor whether to worship it as the rod of their lawgiver, or to abhor it as the visible symbol of the everlasting disobedience.
the dragon and his victim are a perfect fit for Ruskin's thinking now. Here is a brute, unspiritual creature consuming the young, who should be the hope of the future. I imagine that in this scene of devastated young bodies, Ruskin must have seen the untimely end of Rose Latouche, also cut down far too young by the dragon of illness. In the second Carpaccio painting, St. George drags the dying beast to Silena's Market Square to persuade the Selenites to be baptized in that marvelous faith that conquers dragons. In St. Mark's Rest, Ruskin summarizes the image thus:
the dragon led into the marketplace of the Sultan's capital, submissive, the piece of St. George's spear, which has gone through the back of his head, being used as a bridle. But the creature indeed now little needing one, being otherwise subdued enough, an entirely collapsed and confounded dragon, all his bones dissolved away, prince and people gazing as he returns to his dust.
Ruskin has already urged the visitor to
go forward a little, please, to the second picture on the left, where central is our now accustomed friend, St. George, stiff and grotesque, even to humorousness. You will most likely think him with his dragon in a singular, depressed, and as it were, waterlogged state. Never mind him or the dragon just now, but take a good opera glass and look therewith steadily and long at the heads of the two princely riders on the left, the Saracen king and his daughter. He in high white turban, she beyond him in the crimson cap, high like a castle tower.
Now, I know this is heresy, but personally, I think Ruskin may be mistaken about the princess. From her hat and gown, I'd say the princess is the girl walking in her red shoes, holding her father's hand. But Ruskin's words apply equally well to both female figures. He says,
look well and long, for truly, and with hard-earned and secure knowledge of such matters, I tell you, through all this round world of ours, searching what the best life of it has done of brightest in all its times and years, you shall not find another piece quite the like of that little piece of work, for supreme, serene, unassuming, unfaltering sweetness of painter's perfect art. Over every other precious thing, of such things known to me, it rises in the compass of its simplicity, it being able to gather the perfections of the joy of extreme childhood and the joy of a hermit's age with the strength and sunshine of midlife all in one, which is indeed more or less true of all Carpaccio's work and mind. But in this piece, you have it set in clothes, jewelry, radiant, inestimable.
The third picture shows St. George baptizing the Selenite royal family. The costumes, and particularly the turbans, are rendered with vivid detail. Now, hats are always important. They surmount the face and they draw attention to it. Ruskin would agree. He once joked that
you hear of me, among others, as a respectable architectural man-milliner, and you send for me that I may tell you the leading fashion and what is in our shops for the moment, the newest and sweetest things in pinnacles.
Center lower part of the picture, we see the turban pinnacle laid down as the old pagan faith is laid down by its owner. Here's what Ruskin has to say of this painting.
Triumphant festival of baptism, as at the new birth of two kingly spirits. Trumpets and shawms, high and resounding transport, yet something of a comic, no less than rapturous in the piece. A beautiful scarlet parrot, must we call him, conspicuously mumbling at a violet flower under the steps. Finding him the scarletest and mumblingest parrot I have ever seen. I tried to paint in 1872 for the natural history schools of Oxford, perhaps a new species or extinct old one to immortalize Carpaccio's name and mind. When all the imaginative arts shall be known no more, perhaps in Darwinian Museum, this scarlet Epops Carpaccii may preserve our fame. But the quintessential thing of all, St. George's own attitude in baptizing. He has taken a good plateful of water to pour on the Sultan's head. The fount of inlaid bronze below is quite flat, and the splash is likely to be spreading. St. George, carefulest of saints, it seems in the smallest matter, is holding his mantle back well out of the way, I suppose, really, and truly the instinctive action would have been this, pouring at the same time so that the splash might be towards himself and not over the Sultan. With his head close to St. George's foot, you see a sharp-eared white dog with a red collar round his neck. Not a greyhound by any means, but an awkward animal, stupid looking, and not much like a saint's dog, nor is it in the least interested in the baptism, which a saint's dog would certainly have been. The mumbling parrot and he, what can they have to do with the proceedings? A very comic picture.
There are more Carpaccios in the Scuola and more Ruskins on them, but sadly we don't have much more time. Instead, a note for new readers of St. Mark's Rest. In this book, Ruskin lets someone else Ruskin him. His own tour of the paintings is succeeded by a chapter of intense research into the symbolism and artistic historiography. This chapter was written by James Ready Anderson and is called The Place of the Dragons. Ruskin, having edited it, introduces it with intense praise. I hope that you shall all be able to go to Venice soon. I hope you'll visit the Scuola Dalmata. The tourist tide has swept back into town, but you will find this Scuola a place of peace. I suggest reading the Ready Anderson chapter for information first, and then Ruskin for pure pleasure. I'd like to finish by contrasting a cruise ship with a Carpaccio. This image of Venice painted in 1516 for the Camerlengi Palazzo. The lion has one paw on the land, another on the word of God, and two back paws planted lightly in the water, where they do no damage. The message of 1516 was that Venice held land and sea in benevolent, peaceful, and creative mastery. The lion's wings also gave Venice mastery of the air, sheltering the ships arriving with goods from foreign lands. And again, impactlessly, gracefully. How comfortable and right that lion looks in Venice, as comfortable as one of her too few modern cats. This is Venice as a creature among creaturely things. To signal its virtue even in power, the big cat wears its own halo and a serious expression. What a cruise ship wears is a plume. That's the pretty name given to the toxic smoke that issues from every cruise ship, often invisibly. The cruise line's profits come at the expense of the lungs of every citizen in every coastal town it passes, at the expense of marine life exposed to its sewage and scrubbed sulfur. The cruise lines have for years been allowed to do what they do everywhere, commodify Venice and her waters. Who sold the stones of Venice to whom? Too many people, too many organizations treat Venice as a resource to enrich their private portfolios, not as a living city. On December 26th this last year, a fire started in Marghera, spreading from one industrial unit to another. This black plume spread over the city. To me, the flattened plume immediately recalled Ruskin's dragon. The dragon-like consumption of Venice by tourists is something we should not, however, demonize entirely. Tourism has an honorable pedigree in Venice. It's just that sometime in the late 20th century, it swiveled and tipped into the grotesque. This is the second time that Venice has become a parable for the world. In the late 18th and early 19th century, there was a legenda nera, a black legend, that the 1,000-year-old republic fell because she'd partied too heedlessly and too long. She'd failed to act like a responsible, serious city, using her gunpowder for fireworks instead of defense. Now we have a new legenda nera, that Venice let herself be dominated by tourism, that she failed to respect herself and has come to this pass by dereliction. Into this scenario rolled the Acqua Grande of November 2019, 85% of the city underwater, just 6 centimeters less than the famous disaster of 1966. And a few months later, COVID befell the city, sharp as a metaphor. Venice has fallen. The dragon is in the descendant, however you characterize it. But in what seems like a hopeless context, I do see hope. I find hope in the form of active organizations like No Grandi Navi and Venezia Ambiente, run by Venetians for Venice. They run on passion, though, without subsidies or grants. If you want to help, donate. Venice's prosperity has always been supported by and refreshed by outsiders who are also insiders. I ask you to remember the Schiavoni, historically those who most loudly protested against crimes against the serenity of Venice. They merit your attention. They bear living testimony to the creative way of living together for mutual good, a lesson for all the foreigners who try to live lightly but usefully in Venice today. For me, half of a Slav, the Scuola Dalmata represents not only historical continuity, but also authenticity, two battles Venice faces today with increasing grimness. The Scuola Dalmata cycle of paintings is the only one of Carpaccio's remaining in its original site. Even more pleasingly, in the context of these talks, the scuola that commissioned it is still in existence, with 300 Venetian fratelli and sorelle, many of whom proudly give their time to work there. As in 1451, all the scholars' affairs are still administered by a master and a council. In their red robes and insignia, the confratelli still take part in all the great historical ceremonial of Venice. The Scuola Dalmata is held together by living Venetians and the world's love for Vittore Carpaccio. You may visit it with dignity and linger here for hours without Instagrammers. In this place, you find beautifully and sensitively restored some of the art that Ruskin prized, a virtuous model for art and life in Venice, and also everywhere. So be one of the people to whom Ruskin dedicated St. Mark's Rest. Be one of those few travellers who still care for her monuments. Show it by going to see this place that Ruskin found sacred. Even the entrance ticket is a little work of art. Take St. Mark's Rest with you. Sit and read. Read Ruskin and read Carpaccio.
The pictures having the effect you will feel presently of a soft evening sunshine on the walls, a glow from embers on some peaceful hearth, cast up into the room where one sits waiting for dear friends in twilight.
Dear friends, thank you.
Woo! All right, that was amazing.
That was indeed amazing. And on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Michelle and Joseph for a really wonderful evening. It's shed fascinating light on so many aspects of Venetian history and art, as well as Ruskin's deep connections with the city. What was really impressive to me was the really well-judged way that you connected Venice's past and present, and in the Ruskinian way that you connected environment, social issues, art, culture, all the kind of things that Ruskin himself did. It was really brilliant. So it was a privilege to hear both of you speak. You've given us loads of things to reflect on and provide endless impetus for us all to take up Ruskin's works, either in the comfort of our own homes or, better still, amongst the stones of Venice. Thank you ever so much. It's been a privilege. And thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. Simon will be posting the booking for the fourth reading and the conference in the chat for those who are interested, and we hope you can join us for those. And with that, I'll draw the event to a close, and with best wishes for a pleasant weekend and evening for all of you. Thank you.